Hello, and welcome back to our Housecall Pro QuickBooks Online integration series. I am, of course, Tomasz Waples, and I will be talking through today the basics of what flows from Housecall over to QuickBooks. Now, if you have not already watched our initial integration setup video, or if you're planning on importing data and you haven't watched that video either, I am going to suggest you go take a quick look at those. We are going to be kind of referring back to certain things that we have talked about in those earlier videos. Second thing I want to say is this video is a broad overview. So we're going to be primarily focused in Housecall, talking about what does and doesn't flow over and kind of how that flows over. We'll also have more detailed breakdowns of each individual piece, the customers, the jobs, the invoices, such like this. We'll have more detailed breakdowns of exactly how things are going over. And in those cases, we'll go back and forth between Housecall and QuickBooks so you can see them in both. But for today, we are just going to focus on Housecall. So let me go ahead, share my screen. And of course, we have our test account here. This is probably going to look not dissimilar to your test account after you've imported data, right? We may well see a good number of these unsent invoices here. Do keep in mind, of course, anything that was open in QuickBooks, right? When we looked at that invoice list, anything that was open in QuickBooks imported as open into Housecall and fell into this unsent invoices list. So you can, of course, just go in here and address these as you need to. We'll also see that our customers came in. Now, I had, a few customers, you probably have more in my test account, but we can see that they all came in. Now, I'm hearing customers because they are actually the very first thing that I want to talk about here. Because most, if not all, well, most, definitely not all, of this customer information that we can fill in here is eventually going to find its way over to QuickBooks. So let me just throw some stuff in here. Okay, so first name, last name, and display name, of course, are all going to head over into QuickBooks. Now, this display name is the very important key when Housecall is talking to QuickBooks, especially if we did not import or if we have a customer in QuickBooks that we don't have over here in Housecall. This display name is how Housecall is going to match those two customers, right? So it's very important that if we are hoping for a Housecall customer to match something we already have over in our QuickBooks, that this display name matches. It will already match for any imported customers. This is just for new customers. Next, we have our phone number. Again, we need to have that 10-digit, just like we were talking about before. And this mobile phone, in addition to being where all of the notifications for a customer are going to go, text communication, on my way, job finish, review request, things like this, are going to go to this mobile phone number. But this is also the only phone number that's going to push back over into QuickBooks, right? Now, a quick reminder here, for those of you who are thinking back to that video, that import video, where we talked about, hey, maybe your phone number is blank, or maybe it's in a form it won't come in, that's totally fine. By putting the phone number in here, and when that customer goes back over to QuickBooks, which we'll talk more about in a moment, it is going to update QuickBooks. Now, the important thing here is that Housecall makes QuickBooks match Housecall, right? So any changes we make to the mobile phone number, the first name, the last name, the email, these changes are going to carry over into our QuickBooks. Something I do want to point out here, if for some reason we remove a number here in Housecall, when this customer syncs over to QuickBooks, it is going to remove that phone number over in QuickBooks as well. It's going to remove that last name, that first name, that email address. Yes. So it's very important that we think very carefully about removing any information from Housecall Pro when it's tied to QuickBooks, of course, because that will affect what's ultimately in our QuickBooks. So let's throw that phone number back in here. Gonna throw in a company name. And as you can see, if we put in a company name, by default, it is going to override that display name. And email, of course. Now, these fields over here, company, job title, business owner, homeowner, these are not going to go over to QuickBooks at all. The display name will go over, and should these two match, of course, right, that's going to go over into our display name in QuickBooks. But this company field on its own, and the same with job title, are not going to go over. This homeowner business toggle, this does not plug into any of the similar features in QuickBooks Online. This is going to be more about Housecall Pro and more about consumer financing for those of you who offer it, right? Making sure that we don't accidentally send a consumer financing offer to someone who owns a business and wouldn't be eligible. Next, we're going to come down here to our addresses. And of course, we want to make sure that we use this Google verified address, right? It gives us this nice map over here. It's going to give us the picture of the house, the Zillow value, all these nice things once we get over onto the invoice. But kind of for our purposes, for the integration, it's going to make sure everything stays really neat and organized, right? It's going to make sure that the city name is in the city, that the state abbreviation is correct, that the zip code has the right number and correct numbers in it, right? All of those things, it's very easy to make a typo on. Making sure that we're using that Google verified address, it's going to make sure that we don't have to worry about that once we get over into our QuickBooks. Now, address notes, those are not going to go over into Housecall, or those are not going to go over from Housecall, excuse me, into our QuickBooks. We're going to skip this additional address button for now, as well as how the customer sub-customer relationship works. We're going to go more in depth on those in our video on customers, which should be next in our list. But for right now, we're going to leave those alone. One thing I do want to call out down here in the lower left-hand corner, if you are working alongside, if you've made a test customer and perhaps used a real phone number or a real email address, probably want to go ahead and hit that send notifications button, turn that off. Housecall, it is live for you. And so it will send out notifications if we book a job, if we, finish a job, things like this. So we probably want to turn that off on any test customers that we're working on. So we're going to go ahead and create the customer. It's going to pull us in here. The next thing that we're going to talk about is jobs, and more specifically, invoices. Now, don't worry about this invoice number. Your invoices probably look absolutely nothing like this. Again, test account. This came off of the import in the test account. Probably something like, I don't know, how many digits can we have in an invoice number before the integration gets cranky, right? Don't worry about that. This is not expected behavior. If you are seeing this and it's not what you want, go ahead, smash that chat button lower right-hand corner, and have a conversation with them about that. If it is what you want, fantastic, right? We want to keep that. But if you're like, hey, my invoice number should be 432 and it's several billion, you probably want to go ahead, reach out. We can get that fixed for you. Now, when we're talking about the invoice itself, we can send over a couple of things. Obviously, services and materials, although those don't have direct parallels over in QuickBooks. But anything that goes in these line items is going to go over into QuickBooks. Now, just to show here, I'm going to just pull this test item, throw it in here so we can see, we'll have our service name, our description, our quantity, our price. All of these are going to go over to QuickBooks. Again, when we do our invoicing video, we're going to go more in depth into how all of these pieces work. Suffice it to say, the invoice is going to go over along with our total, along with our tax rates, along with any payments that we make. The main focus, though, of what we're talking about here are going to be these buttons up top, this finish, invoice, and pay, because these are the three trigger actions, the three trigger buttons to send information from Housecall over to QuickBooks. Because right now, even though we created this customer, right, even though we threw a job on this customer here in Housecall, we could go over to that Housecall QuickBooks test account, look all day long. We would not find this ABC property customer, right? It's not until we've completed work on a job, right? Again, making sure that notifies off, requested payment, right? Sent the invoice to the customer saying, hey, it's time, give us our money, right? Or actually received that payment, that the invoice is going to go over into QuickBooks. Now, you may be sitting there and be thinking, hey, Tomasz, that's all well and good, but sometimes I need the invoice to go over at a different time, right? Well, we got these three little buttons. Let me do that again. I made a little fast. If we go all the way down to the bottom of the invoice and we see this QuickBooks Online tile, we got these three little buttons over here at the side, and we can always push this invoice or payment over to QuickBooks. Now, again, you're looking at this and you're like, hey, Tomasz, you said finish invoice pay. We hit finish up top. How come this invoice isn't over in QuickBooks yet? Well, the short answer is that the integration, it's close to real time, but it's not quite, right? Between the time we hit that finish button, that invoice button, it might take 3 minutes, might take 5 minutes for the invoice to find its own way over, right? This isn't going to be something probably you even notice in your day-to-day, especially if your techs are using those status buttons out in the field, or you're using those status buttons out in the field. You're probably not going to notice this delay, but if for some reason, maybe it's the end of the month, you're just going through, checking some stuff, cleaning some stuff up because mistakes happen, we're only human, right? And you don't want to wait, you can always just hit that push invoice or pay button. It will open up a new link, or it will show you the link. If you click on it, it will open up a new tab and actually pull you into our QuickBooks. If you were signed in. I'm not signed in right now because we're primarily focusing on Housecall, but we'll take a closer look at that again when we really focus on the invoice. Same thing with payment. We can put a payment on here and it will update the invoice over in QuickBooks, right? So maybe we finish the invoice, we have to make some changes to the line items. We do that, then we send the invoice, we hit this invoice button. It's going to make some changes in QuickBooks. It's going to update it to whatever we have here in Housecall. Then customer pays exactly what we want to happen. Housecall is going to update the invoice here to paid, and we're going to send that updated invoice over into QuickBooks to mark it paid there as well. The reason I'm kind of going through this a little bit is just to kind of re-emphasize the point that I made earlier with customers, that Housecall makes QuickBooks match Housecall, right? So once we start making our invoices here in Housecall, we really want to make sure we keep making our invoices here in Housecall, because any changes we're making in QuickBooks, they're not going to come back over here into Housecall once we've done that first integration, right? Once we've done that first integration, with a few little exceptions, it's a one-way sync from Housecall back into QuickBooks, right? This is how we keep the QuickBooks file safe, right? We don't want anything to be bouncing back and forth and causing any kind of issue, right? So we say, hey, no, just from Housecall straight over into QuickBooks, right? The last thing that I want to talk about then here on the invoice is going to be down here at the bottom with this pull payment from QBO and this add local payment. Now, both of these have to do with circumstances where there's something going on with the payment that isn't happening necessarily in Housecall, right? Maybe you've been using QuickBooks Online to collect your payments, or, like many businesses, you've been entering your check payments directly into QuickBooks Online, and old habits, right? If we do it, not that big a deal. We just come into the invoice here in Housecall and we hit pull that payment from QBO. It's going to grab the payment that you made over in QuickBooks and pull it back, right? This is one of those rare exceptions to that one-way rule. But, right, because it is an exception, this is an invoice by invoice thing, right? We're going to go one by one when we're doing this. So we probably don't want to have to do it too often. It's not the fastest process in the world, right? So we want to get in the habit of putting that payment here in Housecall, right? And then, of course, for adding a local payment, there's a number of reasons why we might use this. Maybe you're using your own credit card processor, something other than Housecalls, right? Or maybe the the person, they paid in cash and we forgot to enter it in house call, and now it's already in QuickBooks and it's in the bank, and if we just added a regular payment, it would send another payment over, and we don't want to deal with that, right? Or maybe, heaven forbid, and hopefully it never happens, right, person isn't going to pay, right? And so we don't want it sitting here open in house call, but we certainly don't want to send a payment over to QuickBooks. The accountant needs that invoice open, right? So that they can write it off, so they can claim it, right? That's when we're going to add a local payment. This is going to allow us to add a payment that is very specifically not sent to QuickBooks, right? So if we add this local payment, we're only adding it here in house call. It is not going to QuickBooks Online at all. Just to close this out, I'm just going to go ahead here, throw a check payment on here, just so we can see it, right? Push it over to QuickBooks again, just to speed it up a little bit. And of course, once we see it's been successfully synced down here, we see this one transaction here. We can see that check has been synced over to house call, or has been synced over from house call, is over in our QuickBooks. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here, when we're talking about items that go from house call to QuickBooks, is this price book. Now, there's a lot to say about price book, and we're going to have a video specifically for price book so we can go into all those little details. But big picture, anything that we create here in house call is going to find its way over to QuickBooks once we've put it on an invoice, right? Because remember, finish, invoice, pay, those are the three triggers. So we have to, have a finish, invoice, or pay associated with that item. That's not going to happen until we put it on an invoice. So we create an item, we put it on an invoice, that invoice gets paid. It's going to head over into QuickBooks, and it's going to land in our products and services section as a service. Now, when we break this down for you a little more, we'll go into the hey, you can change it in QuickBooks if you need to, and things like this, and setting the income accounts. But for right now, the important things to know is that the name, the description, the cost, and whether or not the item is taxable by default, these things are all going to go over into our QuickBooks when we create the item. Now, as I said, this is a pretty broad overview of what goes over from Housecall Pro into our QuickBooks. And we're going to have more detailed sections for each of the things that we've talked about: customers, invoices, payments, items. We're also going to go more in depth on tax rates and classes, business units in Housecall, which we have not talked about at all yet, but we're going to go more in depth on those things. But got one more thing I want to talk to you about before I let you go, and that's going to be this alert center. Now, Housecall and QuickBooks, they're two separate systems, right? And they have slightly different rules about what you can put where and how. And, you can have two customers with the same name in Housecall, but you can't have that in QuickBooks because that's a QuickBooks rule, right? But we understand that, of course, sometimes you're in the field and you don't have time to try and search and find, and do I have this customer and do I have that customer? Things like this, they happen every day, right? When it comes to QuickBooks, Housecall, we're not going to send anything over into your QuickBooks that's going to hurt your QuickBooks, right? We're not going to send over a duplicate customer and try and force it into your QuickBooks. That's not what QuickBooks is for. It's not good for QuickBooks, right? Instead, we're going to flag it here, and we're going to say, hey, you know what? We tried to send this customer over to QuickBooks, but it looks like there's a customer with the same name in QuickBooks that's already attached to somebody else here in Housecall, right? Fine. Probably a merge situation. Not necessarily, but probably, right? Or maybe you do have two customers with the same name and you want to, give one a slightly different name. You want to throw in a middle initial, or you want to throw in the street address or something like that, just something to differentiate the two. That's all you're going to have to do. And then you can go ahead and reprocess these alerts, right? They're going to happen from time to time. I don't want you to worry when they do happen. It is normal. It is expected. Everyone runs into them from time to time, right? We just want to make sure we're on top of processing those alerts because, of course, If there's something in here, if something's been flagged in this alert center, it means it's not over in our QuickBooks, right? And that's obviously not a situation we want long-term. You know, a few hours, maybe a day, it's probably not going to hurt anything too much. But we get to a point where we got alerts in here and they're from last week, last month, that's going to make your bookkeeper, that's going to make your accountant a little cranky, right? Because they're going to need those numbers in QuickBooks to be able to tell you how your business is doing, right? As always, if you see something in here and you're not understanding what it means, it's confusing, it's not resolving itself in the way you think it should, go ahead, smash that chat button, lower right-hand corner, let us know what's going on, let us help you. So with that, I am going to wrap up this overview video. Down below, you are going to see those links to, customers, invoices, payments, items, as well as tax rates and classes. Go ahead, check those out, as well as articles getting a little bit more detailed on some of the things that you're going to see inside each of these things. Other than that, I am going to say welcome to Housecall Pro. I hope you enjoy Housecall and enjoy using our integration. We will talk to you soon.